If you could run one utility 30 minutes a day while aim training and break some of your long-standing plateaus in just a couple weeks, would you do it? I went through the pain of running a sensitivity randomizer for 3 weeks, so you don't have to. And this is what I've learned along the way. As always, links and timelines will be in the description below, but strap in, this is going to be a fun one. So before we get into what the tool is and how it works, understand that this isn't an exact science. This is something that comes up a lot in the AIM community. I've noticed people talk about the fact that people who contribute to ideas that help people improve aren't scientists, and this isn't science. And they're right. You know, it's true. This isn't isolation. There's no control groups. There's so many things that scientists do, that real scientists, that make information that we get from the research usable and valuable and unique, using empiricism to find truth. And this is more of like an applied science. It uses scientific principles and ideas real scientists would take and use. I'm an engineer, so this is more of an applied science as well. We use a lot of the same types of components that are used in scientific studies, but without going through the really rigorous empiricism that you need to do in a scientific field. That said, it's not total junk, and I'm going to talk about my individual experience and what I've learned as a part of this video, so you can make a decision for yourself if you think it's going to work for you. And I think one of the topics that we have to discuss, I hate having to discuss this yet again, it's controversial and it shouldn't be. And I think in a couple years, this is going to be common knowledge that, you know, muscle memory is not a thing when aiming. Forcing yourselves to have a static sensitivity isn't a thing when you're improving aim. But right now, a lot of people kind of hold those assumptions and they hold those beliefs, so we have to talk about it. I personally believe, and a lot of people in the aim community believe, that changing your sensitivity on a regular basis will not work against you. Not only that, but it might help you. In this video, I'm going to talk about how it helped me. And this happens whenever there is a complex skill. The way human beings work, when we first kind of learn something, we think we understand everything there is to know about it once we dip our toe in it. And we tend to oversimplify the learning process at first. I'm actually really into cooking. You can use this analogy for a lot of different things, like driving, learning an instrument, or math. I am into cooking. I've been doing it for over 15 years. Newcomers at cooking always think it's about learning the recipes. If you get good recipes, then you can make good things. But really, it's about learning the underlying techniques. When you learn how to make a roux, you can make gravies and sauces. You learn to sear, and you can cook all kinds of meat correctly using a Maillard reaction, which is a scientific thing which creates a crust that makes the meat tastier to humans. Braising, deglazing. If you learn how to make biscuits, you learn how to fold fats into flour to create a flaky crust, and that's how you make pie crust, and that's why it's so good. If you understand all of these underlying techniques, you can make most recipes, and you might not even really need to follow a recipe. Usually what I'll do is I'll find a couple different recipes for something that I want to cook, because I understand the components of how it should be built. So this is what I've seen in aiming. Newcomers think that you're supposed to be memorizing movement patterns and practicing them over and over so you can just repeat them unconsciously when you're in a combat situation without thinking about it, right? Or you're memorizing the physical distance you have to move your mouse as points on a screen, for example. So if your FOV or your sensitivity changes, any of those things that you've memorized along the way just go away. Another thing is that people think that if they take a break from aiming, they'll just unlearn everything that they've been learning. But really what you're doing is you're learning techniques like reactivity, reading, target acquisition, precision, smoothness, all of these mechanics that get rolled into what is referred to as overall mouse feel. And you can apply these techniques to any FPS, any FOV, any sensitivity. And this doesn't mean that you won't be more comfortable at a certain FOV or sense when you're playing in game. Of course, you would want to have something that you're comfortable with and you're familiar with. Learning overall mouse feel will help you understand what are good FOVs and sens for the situations in the games that you're playing. So going back to the cooking analogy, let's say that you're an amateur cook and you want to impress your friends. You could learn a recipe and you could memorize it and you could just make it over and over again. And when those conditions are set up for you, you could recreate that recipe really well, probably impress the shit out of your friends, right? But then let's throw you into Iron Chef or Top Chef, and you don't have the ingredients, you don't have your kitchen, you don't have any recipes, you don't know what they're going to tell you to make. You're going to get destroyed. You're first one that's voted off, right? It's the same thing with aiming. You could set up your exact conditions that are optimal for you. Let's say you like to snipe. You're not getting any pressure. You have an FOV and a scope and a sens that you like. You've been practicing this. You set it up in kovaaks perfectly, so it's exactly how you want it, and you've memorized exactly where you need to move your mouse cursor for those dots. What happens if you get pressured? What happens if you don't have that scope? What happens if you don't have that gun? What if you don't have that sens? What if a team rolls up on you, right? What are you going to do? If you're in a competitive scene, you're in a battle arena, for example, you're going to land and you got to roll with a pistol that you've never used before in order just to survive to get to the end game where you had that sniper you want. Those are the types of situations that you want to learn if you want to be competitive at FPS. If you just want to impress your friends or make a cool video that shows you with some badass flicks or some, cool snipe headshots, then sure, you can memorize and you'll probably be fine. So who should and who should not use this tool? If you need a challenge and you feel like you're stagnating and you can't identify a specific weakness that you need to improve, or if you're just looking for a way to change things up and keep things interesting, I would suggest using this. If you're really interested in optimizing your improvement in aiming so that you improve the fastest, I think this will help you as well. You shouldn't use it if you believe that changing your sensitivity is bad. If you fundamentally, in your heart of hearts, refuse to accept that changing sensitivity regularly is good for you, I can't help you, and you probably shouldn't use this tool. If you're still new to aim training or you have trouble finding your right sensitivity already, I'm kind of on the fence. I've never been in that position myself. I would say you probably should learn the fundamentals and mechanics and feel comfortable in changing your sens before you start using this tool. It might work against you if you don't, or if you just like to sit back and grind mindlessly. If you're just doing kovaaks because it's fun and you want to watch TV while you're doing it and not really pay attention, you probably shouldn't use this tool. So why does it work? Or more importantly, why does it purport to work? I've read opinions on this from the person who made it. His name is Whisper, who actually has the #1 Air Nuns score in the world, and he is a fantastic tracker. It forces you to use parts of your arm that you might not otherwise use, and typically you have to try a variety of different scenario types to get that same experience. It forces you to be more actively engaged in your aim training because it's constantly fucking with your sens. You can't just sit back and zone out. I believe, and Whisper believes, if you read his Reddit post on this, that it helps you with focusing on developing mouse feel because it's constantly changing around, pushing. You feel a push and a pull while you're using it, which I'll talk about later. And it helps you just develop mouse feel faster than you probably would without using it. So how to use it? It's pretty straightforward. They have a GitHub and they built some releases, so you can just download the latest release. It's going to ask you to install a driver interceptor, essentially, which is like an intermediary that runs between your inputs to allow it to inject, whatever it's injecting to change your sensitivity on a regular basis. So know that it's doing it at the OS level. It's not specific to any game. It's just constantly going to be messing with your mouse while it's running. You're going to need to reboot after installing it. After you set it up the first time, all you have to do is run it, and it's a very low impact executable. You'll barely even notice that it's running other than the fact that it's messing with your sens. There are some settings that you can change. It talks about it in the GitHub, but if you were going to read the GitHub, you probably wouldn't be watching this video, so I'll walk through it. So in the config, they have a few different settings. The very top one says type, and essentially what type does is it defaults to 1. 1 is more of like an analog smoothing effect versus what they call like a step-like smoothing, which is more like digital. And I left most of the settings to defaults. I'll talk about which ones I did modify. The baseline sensitivity defines the sensitivity multiplier that you're going to be using, which affects the min sensitivity and max sensitivity. There's really no reason to change this. The min sensitivity and max by default is 0.5 and 2. So that means that constantly adjusting your sensitivity, it is going to use those half of your sensitivity and double your sensitivity as the low points and the high points. I changed this to 0.75 and 1.5. Can't hurt to try default and see if it works for you, and then you can just tune it. if it's too much. Spread is how fast and how wide the swings and the sensitivities can happen. It's kind of hard to explain, but while you're playing it, if you leave this default, you'll definitely notice frequently changing your sensitivity. You can make this a bit more of a pendulum-like change where it will stay at a higher sens for a longer time, and then you could feel it slowly going back to a lower sens and it'll stay there for a long time versus just constantly switching between them. I tried both for about a week and a half, and I gotta say that either way, it's gonna take some time to get used to it. I would suggest not changing this setting a lot. Just try picking one and going with it. For smoothing, that determines how smooth you'd like your randomization to be. And on his GitHub, he basically says 0 is no smoothing and 5 is incredibly smooth. By default, it's 2. I have it set to 1. The time step allows you to control how often your sensitivity changes when you're using the step-like sensitivity, which is type 0, and we're using type 1, so don't worry too much about this. Runtime is how long it actually runs, and from what I've noticed, the program doesn't seem to use an actual time measurement, even though if you set it to 30, that's 30 minutes, but it's based on how often your mouse is moving. Just keep in mind, like if you keep it at 30, it will run probably for 45 to 50 minutes of your aim training, which I like to train for an hour. I wanted it to run for only 30 minutes. So it might be something you're gonna have to play with and just monitor it. Visualizes if you wanna see it, some kind of plot. I didn't mess with that. I don't really care. And then debug. I mean, debug is always a debug thing. You can just leave that to 1, doesn't matter. So one thing to keep in mind while this is running, this should be plainly obvious. It should have been to me, and I didn't even think about it. But the first time I ran it, I was like, oh, it's constantly changing your sensitivities in the middle of the scenarios while I was using kovaaks. And it's not from scenario to scenario. Obviously, it has no way of knowing what scenario you're on. So just keep that in mind. It's a little odd at first. Give it some time, try to get used to it. Some other little nuances, sometimes it pauses, so I like to have it up on the other screen just so I could see it. I think if you stop moving your mouse for a little bit, it'll pause on its own. You can also hit the P button yourself and pause it. Like let's say you're on a scenario and you're just hitting a sens that feels really great for you. And you want to keep it, then you can pause it, see what it is, and maybe you just found a new sens that you like. And there's an aimer who has a really cool guide. His name's Krasky. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. He posted his settings, and I ended up changing my settings to match his about halfway through while I was running this experiment, and it immediately threw me off again. But I do like the settings, and honestly I like the default settings other than the min and max sensitivity. I think you could do either and it would work fine for you. I would say just try to stick to them once you get settings that you like. So my observations while I was running this, I was taking notes as I ran it. I noticed it helped me focus on problems I'm encountering while running the scenarios, like not drawing direct lines between two targets, over or under correcting, not quickly reacting back to targets when they change movement, things that you want to be focusing on and improving on your aim anyway through like BOD review. You'll definitely notice a pull or a slide when the sens is changing. I can always tell now when the sens is changing without even looking at it. And it's kind of interesting. It's something that you can't really explain. You'll feel it for yourself. It makes you think more consciously about the speed your cursor is moving in terms of mouse control. By that I mean, if you're sitting there doing like a clicking scenario, you're at a sens that you are comfortable with, and then it just drops and drops and drops. Suddenly you got to use a lot more of your mouse pad and use a lot more of your arm to hit those dots, right? You start getting actively engaged and thinking about it. I started even having good runs on scenarios that I normally wouldn't run at a higher speed that require a lot of precision, like static dots or like target switching. I found that I was actually doing pretty well even at the higher sens. If nothing else, it can help you realize that you might do better at a higher sens, which is notorious for being like unstable, obviously, because it makes your jittery movement a lot more apparent. And overall, I just started to really get in tune with mouse feel. It helps the confidence, and I think it helps you build a lot of the fine muscles that are in your mouse hand that you need for things like stability, speed, and precision. So now I'm going to go through some of the metrics that you can get through the kovaaks interface. They added a stats section in the last update, and it's not full featured yet, but it does give you a lot of information. It's a little clunky to use, and it groups things into averages in terms of plotting points. So when I started using the randomizer on the 4th of January in 21, so looking at Fortnite Gliders 360, I've been running this scenario for a very long time. It's part of the Pure G smooth routine, and I use that once a day as part of like a warm up, but I did hit my highest score ever. You see there is a dip on the 4th of January when I started using this. I mean, a pretty significant one, and that's a common theme throughout all of these. Popcorn GTI smaller and Popcorn GTI, you can see kind of flat trends over a very long period of time, months and months, a massive spike after using the randomizer. Fugla XY reactive R aim, that's a reactive scenario. This is one of those scenarios that I run high frequency over a short period of time, so there's not a ton of history, but I broke my record on this after using the randomizer. Air Angelic for Voltaic and the easy one, those were scenarios that were pretty flat overall after using the randomizer. On Air Angelic for Voltaic, you can see a pretty big dip when I first started using the randomizer, and then I do hit my highest score. Pet Circle Switch Small NR Static, a pretty good target switching scenario. That was fairly flat. You can see a dip after I start using the randomizer, and then I do get fairly flat after that point, but still hitting some of my highest scores, and I do hit my highest score ever. Pet Circle Switch NR Static, the non-small version, on the other hand, it was pretty downward trend, and then eventually getting roughly back to where my highest score is. And finally, looking at Pokeball Frenzy 1 Wall 4TS, I hit the highest score I've hit. And again, you can see the trend of my scores going down after starting to use the randomizer and then hitting high highs. Okay, those are the stats and the metrics in kovaaks, but what about in-game? I didn't measure performance, and there's no real objective way to do it. I play Apex, which is kind of medium in terms of impact of raw aim, but I did get a lot of 3K plus damage games. I got 10 plus kill games, if that matters, while I was doing aim training using this tool. And of course, I only ran the tool for 30 minutes during my aim training, and I didn't run it while I was playing Apex. It would make no sense to run it while you're playing your game. At a minimum, I didn't notice any decrease in my aim performance and probably a slight increase. I did notice specific situations in complicated fights where I was glad that I had been practicing with my sens constantly changing. If you haven't played Apex, there's this character in the game called Horizon, and she has a tactical ability which it throws down like a teleporter that can just shoot you straight in the air. And while you use that tactical and you try to aim at somebody that normally you would be aiming at them on normal ground, you're now pushed vertically and you're trying to aim while you're moving in a vertical way, and then also kind of moving, air strafing a little bit. It's just really, really challenging aim scenario. But because I was constantly being pushed in my mouse feel while I was using the tool during my aim training, I noticed that I was able to hit my shots a lot more consistently doing that. And that's a type of aim scenario where you should not really be successful. So I think there's a lot of skill ceiling. This tool will help you a lot. So to wrap things up, did I get better scores naturally, or did this tool help? We don't know, right? There's no authoritative empirical way to know this. I didn't clone myself and then create the exact same conditions that I had been doing with my aim training with my exact experience, and then one of my clones runs the tool and I don't run the tool, for example. So there's no way to know what external factors could have contributed to my aim performance, but I did break a ton of my highest scores that I hadn't broken in months. Scenarios that I run every day, I was getting higher scores in, and I'm still getting higher scores in them. So take that for what you will. I want to say that the Sens Randomizer is a tool, but it is not a replacement for intentional practice that unveils your weaknesses and focuses on improving them. I think that it's a good tool to use to help highlight your flaws and how you can get better, and it helps you have intentional practice. You should still have intentional practice. It's not a magic bullet or an easy button. You can't just turn on the tool and then just suddenly you're going to get better scores. There's no mindless grinding here with the tool on. That said, it is useful and it is likely to result in improvement for you overall. And ultimately, if you think of aim training in the context of any other training like weightlifting, or if you're into tennis or cycling, monotony is a thing. You know, we're only human. We get bored, we get disengaged, we lose that spark that we used to have to stay engaged and to keep practicing. So changing things up every once in a while, it's good for you overall in your practice so that you stay with it, because it doesn't matter how good the practice is if you don't do it. But I hope this was useful for you. This is one of many videos that I'm planning on making on some of the resources that are out there that people don't know about. So keep an eye out for some more in the future. And as always, give me some feedback on what you liked about the video, what you didn't like, and things that you would like to see in the future. I wouldn't be a good YouTube creator if I didn't say like, subscribe, tell a friend, and I'll see you next time.